Uh, Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us here for the second of Blue Sky's webinars. We heard from Mark in the webinar previously. Today we're going to hear from Jeremy. Before I unleash Jeremy upon you, I think perhaps I'll just go over a couple of housekeeping items, if I can. First thing, I think the presentation will last around about 40 minutes. Last time it was possibly nudging an hour, so we'll see how we do, but we're certainly aiming for that. If you do have questions, along the bar at the bottom within Zoom, you'll find Q&A. Can I direct people to raise questions via the Q&A rather than via chat? If you possibly could. I've got myself. By the way, I'm Rob Starling at Blue Sky. I'm one of the Chartered Financial Planners, one of the Resolution Accredited Financial Advisors, as well as, of course, a director at Blue Sky. But I've got myself and Jack, another one of our Blue Sky team members who works in the subject and the area around divorce. We're going to be monitoring the questions whilst we leave Jeremy to say his piece. We'll either look to answer the question for you directly on a one-to-one basis. However, if we think there's a question that we think that maybe it would be great for Jeremy to bring to the wider audience, then we'll make it known to Jeremy, and when it's convenient, he'll try to pick that up, and or maybe we'll pick it up for him. But either way, we'll do that. The webinar itself is being recorded, and the recording will be added to the Blue Sky website. I think there's even a YouTube channel where it's on there as well. That's fine. On the website itself, of course, there's lots of other divorce-related material that you might find useful. Copies of the slides will go out via email. And the final point that we'll do towards the end of this session is that we'll post in the Q&A a link to the third and final of the webinars that we'll be doing, which is coming up in a few weeks' time. As far as today's session is concerned, well, we've got Jeremy that's going to be running it. Jeremy is a Chartered Financial Planner. Indeed, he's even a fellow of the PFS, the Personal Finance Society, and of course, a Resolution member. He joins me as a director of Blue Sky, or an owner of Blue Sky. He's been here for 9 years, in fact, and of course, with 9 years experience at Blue Sky, that means he's got 9 years worth of experience of advising around finances on divorce and specifically on pensions. His session today follows on from Mark's session last time round, and this time it's going to major a bit more on the end-to-end process that is the pension sharing report creation. He's going to bring to your attention some tips, issues, things to look out for along the way, and much from there. So we'll leave the session open for a few minutes afterwards. If there's some other questions, people want to hang back and catch up with us there, that's great. But without further ado, assuming I know how to work the Zoom properly, we'll get Jeremy up and running.
Hello. So hopefully that handover has been successful. Rob will be able to give me the thumbs up if he can hear me, hopefully, which is great. So hello, everybody. Welcome to our session today. As Rob said, the second in 3. Certainly hope that the sun is shining in your part of the world as much as it is in sunny Reading. You'll all be pleased to hear, no doubt, that today it's a bit of a breezy run through the end-to-end pension sharing report process. And the good news is that means that there's no mind-bending calculations for you to get your head around this time. So I guess we'll move on to the objectives just in a second. So hopefully my screen will behave and flip on to the next slide. And I guess the idea around today's session, if you like, is to help you see things from an inside perspective in some respects, so that you're aware of some of the issues that we face and how you can communicate these with your clients in order to manage expectations and also to get the best outcome. We will be touching on a little bit of pensions knowledge, but nothing too deep. We'll also be looking at some current topical issues and their potential effects on pension sharing reports and also implementation issues. But before we carry on, let's just run through the objectives and agenda for the day. To understand the pension sharing process end to end, understanding pensions, the basics, what questions to ask in a letter of instruction, deciphering a pension sharing report, which could have been a whole webinar in its own right, one perhaps that we'll come back to another day, implementation issues, and just to present to you the Blue Sky team, if you like. So we're a 15-strong team of administrators, technicians, and planners. We're chartered financial planners, not actuaries, and we'll come on to some of the potential benefits of that a bit later. We've been producing pension sharing reports for solicitors, mediators, and the courts for over 20 years now. So this is something that we've been doing lots of. And all the advisors here are members of Resolution, and you can see that Rob and Mark are both Resolution accredited specialists. Being financial planners, we specialise in translating technical jargon into plain English. We get great feedback on our reports. People say they're easy to read and we get to the answers fast. And we specialise in cases involving defined contribution and large private sector DB schemes, defined benefit schemes, and cases that require some lateral thinking, maybe some financial planning input. And as Mark mentioned in his session a couple of weeks ago, for those cases which only involve a public sector pension scheme and therefore an internal share, it's probably best to refer those to traditional actuaries in this area. One of the things that I think kind of makes us stand out from some of our competitors is that we're always available for pre-case chats and three-way meetings as well to iron out things such as the letter of instruction and to talk about some of the potential issues around the pensions in question. So most of the cases we take on are from solicitors, but we also do deal with litigants in persons as well. And that leads me to our next slide. So dealing with litigants in person isn't without drawbacks. I guess there is a concern that sometimes there's a dominant spouse who wants to game the system, almost wants to preordain the answer, and we have to be a bit careful of occasions like that, and therefore, take a high degree, high duty of care, if you like, and signpost the parties back to their solicitor if it doesn't feel right. One of the things that we did last year was to create a short animation just to outline some of the key points around pension sharing and some of the issues that you need to be aware of. And everybody that approaches us direct rather than through a solicitor gets signposted to this video, this animation, and it's assumed when we take on the case that it's been watched. Excuse me. So feel free to have a look at that on our website. Feel free to signpost your own clients there, and feel free to give us some feedback as well. It's our first stab at doing something like this, but it could be something that we do more of in the future. So moving on to the pension sharing report generation process and also the implementation issues that lie beyond. Of course, it can be quite a lengthy process. We all know that, and that can lead to quite a lot of frustration with clients around how long it takes. And there are real practical issues, of course, that arise from the fact that it takes so long. So starting in the top left-hand corner, you can see there that it all starts with gathering pension information for the Form E. Obviously, that's an interesting exercise in its own right, because that helps us understand what perhaps the direction of travel might be and some of the things that we might learn from that. We then move on to the part where we think about requesting a quote for a pension sharing report, and then hammering out the letter of instruction itself to try and formulate an instruction which is going to ask the right questions. It then takes a while for that then to turn into a pension sharing report. And then after the pension sharing report has been completed, obviously it takes time to review that report, to ask and raise extra questions, and then to agree the pension shares. And only once divorce has occurred can we move on to the implementation part, which in itself can be quite lengthy. And I suspect that in many cases it could take as long as 2 years to complete that whole process. So I think we need to be realistic at the outset as to how long this all might take. And I think we all need to be aware of how we can help speed this process along to try and shorten it. And hopefully my slides and my presentation will give you some tips and ideas here. So of course the jargon as far as pensions are concerned starts quite early. I extracted a few of the questions from the Form E, and already if your pension knowledge is quite basic, you might get bamboozled by some of the terminology that's used in the Form E. I think also the Form E creates a focus on the CE values, and which are potentially helpful and sometimes fundamental to the calculations that we have to perform. They can be somewhat of a red herring, and we'll move on to why that's the case in some later slides. Perhaps gathering data for the Form E is the first opportunity, if you like, that you might want to think about working with a financial planner or an IFA if the client has one, to try and understand how some of the issues could be ironed out. So this slide might represent a bit of a wall of worry for some of you. Pensions are complex. There's no getting away from that. That's in part thanks to the government, which likes to change the rules, well, seemingly every 6 months these days. I've been working in the pension industry for over 25 years, although if you were to look at me, you wouldn't believe it. And often the changes have been quite dramatic and often positive as well. But I think the upshot is that layers upon layer of complexity has been added. However, I do think that having a little bit of pensions knowledge can go a long way. And I think even knowing the differences between defined contribution and defined benefit schemes, and also the difference between private sector and public sector schemes can be extremely helpful in your role. So we're not expecting you to be pension experts by any token, but just a bit of a selling point for us is that that we do training with solicitor firms where appropriate, if requested, and we have put together a few bits of collateral to try and help solicitors understand pensions a bit better, which are freely available on our website. Of course, once the data has been collected by the client, then we can start to glean a few key aspects. So are all of the pensions defined contribution, in which case things might be a bit more straightforward. Or are there defined benefit pensions involved, which potentially adds complexity? Are any of the defined benefit pension schemes public sector? And who has the bigger pensions? Whilst we don't think that using CE values is the right way to split pensions, obviously in the early days of gathering pension data, it would give us some insight into who has perhaps the bigger pension entitlement, and helps us understand what ultimately the direction of travel might be. We can also identify whether any of the schemes might be potentially problematic, and that might include things such as overseas pension schemes, SIPs, self-invested pension plans, which might include a property. If your client's a small business owner and they have a SIP, then potentially it might mean that they have property within their SIP, which makes things a bit tricky at times. We can also identify if any of the pensions are in drawdown, so the client is taking an income from them. I left this point in here, but perhaps should have deleted it in view of the changes announced by the Chancellor a few weeks ago. Up until very recently, of course, lifetime allowance issues were very key in many cases. Perhaps going forward, that's not necessarily the case, although there will still be some implications of lifetime allowance as far as things like tax-free cash is concerned. So I think, depending on our high-level assessment of the pensions in question, this is going to be an influence as to whether we get a pension sharing report, and also what questions we might ask in our letter of instruction if we decide to go to that point. So again, this might be another good time to pick up a telephone and speak with a pension on divorce expert, a POD, or a financial planner. Certainly, if some of the pensions have got a bit more to them than meets the eye. Just to show you one of the bits of collateral that we put together for solicitors, which you can freely obtain from our website. This is a very simple guide to the differences between defined contribution and defined benefit pensions, and will help you identify from looking at the paperwork you get from pension providers as to what scheme potentially that is. I think it's worth checking in on the PAG report, and we know that PAG 2 is coming later this year, and I imagine that at the time we'll do some further webinars to present the findings of that and to explain how some of the practicalities might need to be addressed. So PAG gives some pretty specific guidance on scenarios where a report should be considered. And you can see on the slide there that where cases are above 100,000, certainly uniform public sector schemes, and cases where there are hidden benefits, it's almost certain that a pension report should be recommended. However, then there are no hard and fast rules, and we do understand that many clients are reluctant to pay the costs associated with getting a report. After all, reports aren't inexpensive. I would say, whilst we understand that there will inevitably be a high proportion of individuals that decide not to go ahead with a pension report, make absolutely sure that you document your guidance here. And on our website, there is also a sample disclaimer as well that perhaps you could use if your client decides not to go ahead with a pension sharing report. Now, there are, of course, instances where we don't think a pension sharing report should be obtained or not absolutely necessary. And a couple of these might be a couple with modest pension accrual, probably all defined contribution and no health problems, where they're a similar age. Younger parties, perhaps under 40s, where they've got the opportunity to rebuild pensions going forward. And just modest pensions in general, say where the values are less than £100,000 in total, because the time involved and the costs involved would probably make it counterproductive. We certainly know that if you've got a defined benefit pension scheme, the costs involved in sharing that could run into multiple thousands of pounds. Add that on top of a pension sharing report, then you could be looking at £5,000 or £6,000 just to work out, or just to implement the pension share. And of course, where pension assets are modest in the context of overall wealth, probably not required there. And there's just a quote from the PAG report that you can see. Some of you have probably seen this slide before, but I like to roll it out because I think it probably does illustrate the point. In this particular example, we've got a husband and a wife. The wife is a member of a public sector defined benefit pension scheme, which has a CE of £300,000. The husband has got a Scottish Widows Personal Pension, which also has a CE of £300,000. On the face of it, it might look like a report is unnecessary. However, if we just start to delve into this a little bit deeper, you can see that the wife is on track to receive an index-linked pension of £12,800 per annum, plus a lump sum of £38,400. Whereas the husband, if he were to purchase an annuity and draw an equivalent lump sum, so he could take a lump sum of £38,400 to match his wife, but in terms of being able to secure an income on the open market via an annuity, he could only get an annuity of around £6,800. And when you bear in mind that the potential cost of getting a report is about £2,500 with VAT included, but the potential lifetime cost of getting it wrong could be £180,000. And by the way, that's calculated as being 30 years times the difference in incomes, you can see actually that there could be, there could be quite serious repercussions for not having got a report. In terms of recent trends, we had a seminar recently with pension provider Royal London, and I've stolen one of their slides from them, which shows recent trends in the sense of how many older couples are getting divorced. And you've probably noticed this yourselves. It's certainly something that we experience. It's not uncommon these days for a couple in their 70s to get divorced. And I think this brings with it its own challenges, because there are potentially additional complexities involved with these individuals. So it might be that pensions are in payment, and therefore there might be a need to pay for cash equivalent values. There might be pension protection fund issues. There might be some older pensions in there that have guarantees, and there might be some annuities in payment. And of course, for these people, there's no opportunity for rebuilding finances. So perhaps some creative input might be required with these types of individuals to help the parties maximise resources. It's a sad fact that we regularly see how a couple once together have a nice lifestyle, but when that is divided up into two portions, it means that actually the funds and resources available are unable to support two separate lifestyles at a good level. So a bit about requesting a report fee estimate. And I guess the point of this is that, if we can get it right from the start, then it really can help to avoid delays. So what information is required to request a reasonably accurate fee estimate? Because it usually starts with you guys sending us an email or giving us a ring and saying, can you help me with some costs for a pension sharing report? Now we understand that it's not always possible to provide specific information so that we can give an exact fee quote, but we're always happy to provide general guidance at this stage. But I think it's true to say that the more accurate you can be at this stage, the less likely that things will veer off track or get stuck as we go through the process. So an example of a bad request, if I can put it that way, would be for somebody to jump on the phone and phone Blue Sky and say, I'm looking to get a quote for a pension sharing report. How much will one cost? And from our point of view, that's how long is a piece of string. We have a report fee calculator at Blue Sky, which helps us determine the cost of a pension sharing report. And there's a number of things that feed into that, which would be number and types of pension schemes involved, number of calculations required, are there any additional complexities such as overseas pensions, that kind of thing. So our calculator is really quite precise in terms of helping determine cost. So I think a good example of a fee estimate would be something along these lines, which would be around, I'm looking to get a quote for a pension sharing report. Husband is a member of the XYZ pension scheme with a CE value of let's say £500,000. Wife is a member of the ABC pension scheme with a CE value of £800,000. We need the report to provide quality of income and a full capital offset of any pension share. I'm pretty certain that if we had a pension report fee estimate along those lines, when the letter of instruction came in, there wouldn't be a deal of deviation, and that we could just carry on with preparing the report. So generating a letter of instruction itself, and I would always suggest that if there's any doubts here, that you pick up the phone and give us a ring. We are happy to have three-way calls with both parties and their solicitors if it makes things easier, so that we can kick the tires on some ideas, so we can really get to the nub of what's required here in the report. But in general terms, I think we would usually expect there to be a request for an equality of income calculation, an offsetting calculation, and if we could be specific about the cash value that we were looking to offset, or perhaps the equity in the former matrimonial home that's going to be retained, possibly offset, then that would be extremely helpful. And it would also be interested in knowing exactly what the client wanted or needed. Is there a target level of income rather than just looking at equality of income? Things that we don't think are so helpful to ask might be equality of capital calculations. We'll come on to that in a second, and apportionment, sometimes called ring fencing. PAG doesn't support that. However, we know that in a large number of instances, there is pressure from one of the clients to have ring fencing calculations done, particularly if the marriage was relatively short. So just touching on equality of capital calculations and just a couple of words of warning, if you like. So we think that it's very rare that an equality of capital calculation will be necessary. For defined contribution pensions, the CE value will simply be the value of the underlying fund. Yes, there are perhaps some more complicated defined contribution pensions like SIPPs, which have property within them, but a run-of-the-mill defined contribution pension scheme is just going to be invested in funds which will have a clear and identifiable fund value. For defined benefit pension schemes, that's a bit more complex because the CE value itself has no direct relationship with the income that the scheme will pay out. When I'm on the phone to clients and I'm trying to explain this, I often use the example. Imagine two twins. One works for HSBC, one works for the NHS. Both have accrued a pension of £10,000 per annum at age 60. One of the twins goes to the NHS and gets a CE value, and the NHS come back and say it's £300,000. The other twin goes to the HSBC pension scheme. They come back with a CE value of £600,000. So you can see that different schemes value the benefits in vastly different ways. But the point is that both of those individuals are entitled to a pension of £10,000 per annum at age 60, and that's why we don't advocate sharing pensions based on the CE values. And just to emphasise the point there, particular care when public sector schemes are involved. I think one of the most notable examples is the police pension scheme, where on a number of occasions we have come across policemen in particular who seem to be quite aware of the value of their pension, trying to perhaps go for an offset based on the CE value of their pension scheme, which is unlikely to ever lead to a good outcome. So here's perhaps a bad example of what to ask for. The interesting thing about this particular case is that originally I was asked to provide a quote for an equality of income calculation, and I think based on the schemes involved, the fee was around about £2,000. However, when the letter of instruction came in, suddenly that had morphed into a much bigger beast. And actually, we weren't looking for equality of income at one specific age. We were looking for equality of income at 4 different ages. Rather oddly, in this particular case, the couple couldn't decide exactly when they were together and when they separated, so they asked for 2 different ring fencing periods there. And then for each one of those figures, equality of income figures, they wanted an offsetting figure as well. So pretty quickly we got up to 24 calculations. Now that's going to lead to quite an unwieldy and perhaps unhelpful report, and also quite an expensive report, as you can see on the slide there. Ultimately, I think we quoted £6,500 if they were absolutely sure that they wanted that style of report. So what could be done differently? Well, I think a 3-way call would work perfectly in that instance. In terms of what age to use, we'll delve into that in a bit more detail in a second, but perhaps we should use the normal retirement age of the dominant pension scheme, if there is one. The ring fencing thing is an odd point, I guess, quite nichey, but perhaps they could just meet in the middle. So there's other things that they could do. Now, of course, in this particular instance, it took the parties a further 4 months to decide on whether or not they wanted to go ahead with the piece of work at a higher fee. So that's a lot of time wasted trying to agree that. This is perhaps a good example of a letter of instruction, and I've highlighted some of the points in red there just to kind of pick up on them. So I'm often asked by solicitors, what age should we use to do the equality of income calculation to? And I think, you know, you should give us, in most instances, you should give us the opportunity to determine what we think is the best age and the fairest age to do that. In a number of cases, there'll be a dominant pension scheme, which is larger than others, and we would suggest that nearly all of the time to use that retirement age for that pension scheme is the appropriate thing to do. But give us the opportunity to use our judgment here, and of course, we'll set out our rationale in the report. What income would be produced for each party in the scenario outlined above. And then we move on to a request for an offsetting calculation. And again, this is quite specific. So this is telling us, you know, what to aim for, really. So we know in pounds and pence what kind of offsetting figure we're looking to calculate and how that might manifest itself in terms of reducing the potential income payable to the parties. I think we often see instructions where we're asked to give offsetting figures at parcels, let's say, of £10,000, and you know, ultimately this can increase the cost significantly because each one of those is another calculation. So look, we understand that there are time pressures to get a pension sharing report, but we think actually it's best to go for the basic report and then ask additional questions afterwards, if relevant. And I think it's also useful for you guys to put a kind of an additional statement in there that just gives us a little bit of flexibility to point out anything else that we find in the pension schemes which might be material to the outcome of the calculations. So just some additional points about a letter of instruction and pension sharing reports in general. So state pensions always include. They are potentially a significant part of the overall pension entitlement, so we think they should be included every time. And of course, it's very easy to get a statement online. Ring fencing, we know what PAG says about that. I think the point about ring fencing from our side of the fence is that this does increase complexity massively. And I think we all know as well that because it's very difficult to get historical pension information, that we ultimately have to resort to what we call a straight line method of determining the apportionment, and that's a potentially blunt tool. It can also uncover some skeletons in the cupboard in the sense that sometimes we find that pensions have been transferred into other pensions which have been transferred, and trying to work that one out can be quite difficult. And some other points there that you can see too. Obtaining cash equivalent values for DB pensions, not always relevant. If that scheme isn't going to be shared, then we don't need the cash equivalent value. And if there's no equality of capital calculation required, which we don't think is relevant in most instances, then we just need a statement of the benefits rather than a cash equivalent transfer value. And there's some additional scenarios as well that we think you should be mindful of, which are, you know, the volatility in the defined benefit cash equivalent transfer market last year, where we saw the values of DB pensions fall significantly. Okay. We do, however, think that clients have their part to play in helping collect the information for the pension sharing report, and these days most certainly defined contribution pensions information can be gathered online on online portals. So we would very much encourage that your clients get on the front foot there and obtain that information themselves. I think it's true to say that we will always ask for a letter of authority so that we can ask additional questions of the pension schemes. But in general, we're happy to work with information that's been obtained on portals, because for many of the pension schemes that you can certainly see there, Hargreaves Lansdown, Legal and General, Fidelity, for example, we see these pension schemes every other day, so we understand them inside out. We really just need the values, especially if they're not going to be shared. Now, there are some defined benefit pension schemes which you can access online. One of them is the Teachers' Pension Scheme, and it can be helpful to obtain things like benefit statements of those as well. But I would suggest that always try and gather as much data as possible, send it to us. If it's usable, we'll use it. If we need more information, then you'll have sent us a letter of authority so we can go and obtain that information as well. I think one of the grey areas, I guess, one of the biggest challenges at the moment is around cash equivalent transfer values, when to request an updated one. And we'll come on to that a bit later in the presentation. So beware delays, and I think this is absolutely key really to helping you manage expectations of your clients. So we quote a timescale at the moment, which is 4 to 6 weeks to do the pension sharing reports. Currently, we're turning them around in 5 weeks, but beware provider timescales can be off the scale. So they are just poor. And I think some of you will note some of those names there, such as Capita, Willis Towers, Watson, Barnett, Waddingham. These are all big, what we call employee benefits providers, likely to be the ones that look after defined benefit pension schemes in the private sector. And we tend to find that they can be really quite poor in terms of their turnaround times. We also know that there are other external factors at play. I read a tweet from George Matheson last week around the fact that public sector factor changes are shortly to be made, and this means that there'll be an embargo on public sector schemes producing cash equivalent transfer values, which could be relevant for those schemes which will be shared. So we think end to end, it probably takes about 3 months to get that pension sharing report produced. Okay, so just a summary of the first section, how pension sharing works. Have a look at the animation on our website. Understanding the pension, some pension knowledge goes a long way. Putting a good letter of instruction together, pick up the phone, and be proactive with data collection, get your client on the case. And at this point, if I can just ask Rob, do we have any questions, any points raised by any of our audience members? Okay, I've got the thumbs up to carry on there. So we're now going to move over to the pension sharing report phase. And as I mentioned, this could probably be a topic in its own right. But today we're just looking at some of the high-level issues. So you can see in the bubbles there, probably some of the questions in your own mind that you have when one of these reports lands through the letterbox. Now, just a bit of promotion for Blue Sky. So we think some reports are easier to understand than others. We do see lots of actuaries' reports. We are asked to interpret them on a regular basis, and we do get good feedback on our reports. So we see lots of other people's reports, and we've got a good level of familiarity with their format, assumptions, all of that kind of stuff. And I guess, at a really basic level, first and most importantly, does it answer the questions that were posed? And that's usually going to be equality of income. Does it give a good rationale for the pensions that are being suggested to be shared? Looking a bit more granular, are there things that we need to be aware of? How old are the figures? When were they obtained? What assumptions have been made around growth rates? Do they look reasonable? Are any costs for sharing the pension set out? And offsetting ranges? And this is one we often see because there are some firms out there who give quite huge ranges as far as offsetting figures are concerned, and that might be potentially unhelpful. So understanding the pension report, is this the point at which you seek to get some help? We do lots of work in capacity of shadow expert, and without wanting to steal Rob's thunder, Rob is presenting the next webinar. Just a few thoughts on where to next. So working with a financial planner at this stage can really help in a number of ways, which could be to kick the tires on the report and identify areas of contention, to help identify further questions, to help identify what further calculations might be required, to highlight errors. Yes, they do happen from time to time, and maybe to use this thing called cash flow modeling to try and put the pension shares in the context of the client's life. So it might be a good idea to seek some help at this stage if the report is particularly complex or if there are issues which are quite contentious. So just having a quick look at a Blue Sky report, many of you would have seen these, and I just wanted to highlight a few key things here on a Blue Sky report. So what does this tell us? This grid is on page 2 of our reports, I think, and ultimately it gives you the answer. And clearly there it's to give you the answer to the equality of income at age 60. So what pension scheme is going to be shared, in what proportion, which results in that much going to the spouse, and achieves equality of income at that point. A little value add from our reports, I think, which is that we provide the information to complete the pension sharing annex as well. So the big issue in 2022 was this decline in the value of defined benefit pension scheme CE values. It still has repercussions, and it does leave some dilemmas, because we know that there are some cases that were done perhaps a year ago, 6 months ago, 9 months ago, where a CE value was used, which is considerably higher than the value that ultimately was used for implementation. And this has meant that, you know, our own practical experience of this is that we've seen clients who have ended up with a lot less as a pension share, talking specifically about an external pension share from a defined benefit scheme, where it's ultimately led to them, you know, receiving less income than they were expecting based on the figures in the report. Now, I think it's true to say that last year was quite exceptional for a number of reasons. There were reasons why these values dropped in the way that they did, and I wouldn't expect it to be repeated this year. But it does mean that some clients got values last year, and we're thinking that given what's happened over the last 6 to 9 months, those values are now out of date, and therefore a new value should be obtained. Now that does present a dilemma, because it will cost money to obtain a second CE value in a year. Most schemes charge for that, and some charge a lot of money for what might seemingly seem just like a press of a button. I think some schemes will charge more than £1,000 for that. But, you know, is it worth paying that extra money in order to get a more accurate report, or should perhaps you hold on and wait until the divorce is almost finalised before you then request an updated figure? Perhaps 12 months has gone past by then, where you'll be able to obtain another one with no cost. So a few dilemmas there. This slide just reiterates some of the points that I've made. So what to do when an agreement is reached? Again, PAG is quite clear on what should happen. So as your client should be signposted to an independent financial planner, if applicable. And there's also the responsibility on you to send the single joint expert a record of the decision and the reasons for splitting the pensions. In terms of implementing a pension sharing order, when can I close the file? PAG again is quite definitive here, in that it says that do not close the file until you are certain that the order has been implemented, or the client has given clear instructions to retain responsibility for implementation. And again, lawyers are encouraged to put systems in place to ensure that, as far as possible, the PSO gets implemented so that they can close their file on that case. So just looking at some of the implementation issues that we've seen over the last 6 to 12 months, and which, you know, aren't as uncommon as you might imagine. And if I had all day, I could probably recite quite a few examples here. Recently, we had a Royal Mail pension scheme case, which the PODE had assumed as being an external pension share. Unfortunately for the PODE, they got their facts wrong, and it should have been an internal share. And 9 months down the line, that pension share still hadn't been implemented, and that caused real practical problems for the recipient of that pension share. The scheme fees issues is also quite a common one. We know that many pension schemes charge quite a hefty fee for splitting a pension. And typically fees are shared 50-50. But you can understand that a disgruntled spouse who is losing all the benefits in that scheme has no real incentive to be efficient as far as paying the fee is concerned. And this sometimes does mean that things drag their heels. So perhaps the recipient spouse should pay all of the fees for this aspect, and adjustments made in the settlement elsewhere to counteract this. At least it takes one possible issue off the table. Or they could elect to have their fees paid by having the transfer value reduced when they ultimately have the pension share implemented. So implementation, what's actually required? Well, obviously a pension sharing annex for each scheme to be shared. It doesn't have to have the details of the new provider. There are boxes on the pension sharing annex which ask for the new provider to be named, but actually this can be left blank or TBC. It's quite it's quite usual at this stage for there not to be a new pension scheme identified. It can be useful to send the pension sharing annex to the transferring provider, as this can then initiate contact with the recipient spouse and lead to them sending their own paperwork. Obviously, we need a decree absolute as well. Pensions can't be shared without being divorced, of course. Consent orders sometimes required. There'll be paperwork from the seeding scheme, the transferring scheme, and potentially paperwork from the new scheme if one has been identified at that time. Okay. Now, just beware that there are obstacles frequently put in the way by transferring schemes where they seem to ignore the rule that they have to exercise the pension sharing order within 4 months. We have come across frequent cases where it's taken up to a year. And you can imagine that sometimes this can cause real practical problems if the spouse is relying on the pension share to perhaps buy a new house or to use the income to live on. In an ideal world, I think we would get a letter of authority, certainly if your client's working with a financial planner, for them to be able to deal with the pension scheme directly so that they can help their client through the maze of all the paperwork involved to try and bring things to a conclusion as soon as possible. So again, I think, just being aware of some of the issues that we get when executing a pension sharing award, when trying to get the money transferred from the seeding scheme to a new scheme, there can be significant delays. So, help clients understand what some of these issues might be, try and nip them in the bud before they happen, but also be realistic about how long this whole thing can take. So just to summarize this, just to summarize this section, get shadow expert help with understanding the pension sharing report if you're unsure. It is an additional cost, completely understand that, but I know Rob in the next webinar will give plenty of examples of how this could be very useful. And we would encourage early engagement with a financial planner to help project plan and assist with any pension sharing implementation. Any questions, Rob?
Yes, Jeremy. I did have a question from Valerie. The question was, can you give an overview of what external and internal sharing means? Do you want to take that, or shall I give you a pause for a minute?
No, I'm happy to take that one. Yeah, I should have made it quite clear, actually. So when sharing a pension, at a high level, there's two potential ways that could manifest itself, either an internal pension share or an external pension share. Practically every defined contribution pension scheme, which include personal pensions, stakeholder pensions, auto-enrollment schemes, SIPs, will do an external share only. And what this effectively means is that an amount of money is carved out of the scheme and then transferred to the recipient spouse's own pension scheme, usually another type of personal pension scheme. Private sector defined benefit pension schemes, they nearly always do an external transfer as well. So in other words, unlike the member who has guaranteed benefits when they get to retirement, an external pension share means that a transfer value is sent across to a personal pensions scheme, and unfortunately for the recipient spouse, they don't get to enjoy the guaranteed benefits that the member did. An internal pensions share is almost exclusively, but not wholly, applicable to public sector pension schemes. So we're talking about the NHS, the armed forces, the police pension scheme, where actually the pension share means that the member's ex-spouse becomes a member of that pension scheme in their own right and enjoy a similar shape and style of benefits to the member. So in other words, they have a guaranteed income payable to them at retirement with no investment risk. Anything to add on that, Rob?
No, Jeremy, I think that was very good. Just bear with me. I've just got another question coming in. A lot of the questions we've been able to answer while we've been going along, Jeremy. So hopefully we've answered that to people's satisfaction. I've not yet had a chance to properly read this one, so I'm going to be reading this one out live and blind without thinking about it. If there's a hybrid pension with a CEV of 86k comprising of both DB and to a lesser extent defined contribution schemes, would a pension sharing report be advisable given on the one hand the value of less than 100k, but on the other hand that we've got a DB scheme in there? Oh, that's a dilemma we come across from time to time. That is a difficult one. I think I would probably say if the solicitor was on the phone to me, can you get hold of a statement? Can you give me a bit more information on that scheme? Because for such a low value, it would be great not to have to go to a full-bodied pension sharing report, because it's obviously quite modest. But at the same point, let's just make sure that we understand that there's no bananas there banana skins to trip us up. So I think if that solicitor had a dilemma like that and was speaking to us at Blue Sky, I think the first response would be, what can you get me some kind of redacted statement that gives me a bit more of an inside loop as to what that pension scheme actually is. I hope that's helped a bit.
Yeah, I think that is a tricky one, because hybrid pension schemes, they in themselves come in different shapes and sizes. So I think Rob is right to say that in those particular instances, it's probably worth reaching out to a friendly firm of financial planners who are experts in divorce to get their opinion on the matter. So you'll all be pleased to learn, no doubt, that we're drawing this webinar to a close. So happy that you can all get back to your desks well within an hour. But one final slide, and just a bit of an appetite whetter, I think, for the next session, which I think could be, really quite exciting actually, because it will introduce you to perhaps a world that you've never seen before, and maybe give you some ideas about how you could work with your clients going forward in a way that you don't currently. So look, pension sharing reports are often essential to uncover unforeseen pension issues and to uncover their true value. Although I think, and I don't want to shoot ourselves in the foot as producers of pension sharing reports, that they can be a little bit two-dimensional, in the sense that they only look at one aspect of the finances and do not present a holistic view, which considers other vital and important aspects such as housing needs, cash, investment, business property, etc. In recent years, Blue Sky have worked closely with a number of mediators and enlightened family lawyers using our financial planning software, which we call cash flow modeling, to bring to life and expand upon many of the issues highlighted, but perhaps not resolved by the pension sharing report. In our next session, Rob will outline in detail the potential benefits for you and your clients of working with a divorce specialist financial planner, and perhaps using cash flow modeling as an effective tool to create better outcomes for all parties concerned. That's all I'm going to say about it today. Hopefully you've all got something out of today's session. It has been quite a quick run through many of the things that you probably know already, but hopefully you've got some bits there to take away and think, oh, I didn't know that. Well, that's going to help me going forward, which is what the purpose of these sessions is. And of course, look, if you and your team are looking for some more help around pension sharing and pension sharing related aspects, then do reach out, contact us. We do webinars, we go into offices, we do lots of training with lawyers. We're here to help. So thanks very much for your attendance today and sticking with me, and look forward to seeing you at the next one.
Thank you, Jeremy. And just finally to say, we have added into the chat the link to the third webinar, which I'll be presenting, and we'll be covering the various different aspects as to where you might want the help of a financial planner all the way through the process. It does also lead on quite nicely from my own experiences recently at the Financial Planning on Separation conference that was run by Resolution for financial planners who have chosen to specialise in assisting people through divorce. So hopefully you'll be keen to come back and have a listen to that, and we'll see if we can help you with some other thoughts along the way. Anyway, thank you very much for joining us, everyone.